My stepmother told me, casually, over dinner, that she had finally gotten rid of that urn, my mother's ashes, because it was time for Dad to move on. I could not breathe. I thought I had lost the last piece of my mother forever. Then I remembered something the crematorium director had said 7 years earlier, something I had completely forgotten until that exact moment. And I picked up the phone. 7 years ago, I lost my mother Mary. Her ashes sat on my dresser. Last night, my stepmother Barbara threw them away and told me it was time to move on. What she doesn't know is the crematorium has been holding a second portion, and a letter from my mother. But first, let me take you back. My mom, Mary, died of ovarian cancer 7 years ago. I was 23, and I thought the world had ended. She was the kind of woman who wrote thank you notes for everything, who still sent care packages to my dorm room even when she was going through chemo. She planned her own funeral because she didn't want me or my dad, Robert, to carry that weight. At the crematorium, the director, a quiet man named Charles, walked us through the paperwork. He asked if we wanted to participate in their legacy portion program. For no extra charge, the facility would retain a small sealed portion of the cremated remains in case of future memorial needs, or if the original urn was ever lost, damaged, or involved in a family dispute. He said it carefully, like he had seen things go wrong before. I barely heard him. I was drowning in grief. But my mother had already checked the box on her pre-arrangement form, and she had attached a sealed envelope with my name on it. Charles locked it in their vault. I signed, and I forgot. For 2 years, it was just me and Dad in that house. I kept the urn on my dresser. Some mornings, I would just touch the smooth ceramic and say good morning. Dad found his own way through the fog, and eventually he met Barbara at a grief support group. She was polished, efficient, and said all the right things. When they married, I wanted to be happy for him, but Barbara began redecorating the moment she moved in. Family photos came down. My mother's reading chair disappeared, and the urn, she said, was morbid. She told me it was unhealthy, that I needed to move on. Dad stayed silent. I argued, I pleaded, and finally I locked my bedroom door whenever I left the house. I thought that would protect the last piece of my mom. But last night at dinner, Barbara set down her fork and smiled. She said, "I finally got rid of that urn. I emptied it into the flower bed and threw the vessel in the trash. It's time for your father to move on." The words stopped the air in my lungs. My father looked at his plate and said nothing. Barbara's face was utterly serene. I thought everything my mother had been, everything she had touched, was gone forever. Then, like a chemical reaction, the memory ignited. Charles, the legacy portion, the envelope with my name. I pushed my chair back, and in the silence of that dining room, I walked out, grabbed my phone, and I called the crematorium. Charles answered on the second ring. I heard the quiet hum of the crematorium's office in the background, the same soft classical music I remembered from 7 years ago when I could barely stand. My voice came out as a whisper. "Mr. Charles, it's Megan Calloway. My mother, Mary Calloway, was cremated at your facility in 2017. I need to know if her legacy portion is still there." There was a pause, the kind where someone is deciding how much to say. "I know exactly which file, Megan. Your mother's prearrangements were very specific. The portion is sealed and stored in our vault, as is the envelope." My knees nearly gave out. That envelope had my name on it, and my mother had written it for me before she died, knowing this day might come. I didn't know how she knew, but I remembered how carefully she had organized everything, the funeral, the flowers, the songs. The woman who had planned her own goodbye had also planned for the war that would follow. I asked Charles if I could come immediately. He said the facility would be open for another hour. I got in my car and drove. The crematorium sat on a quiet road past the old textile mill, a low brick building surrounded by sycamores. Charles met me at the side door. He was older now, his beard fully gray, but his eyes were the same steady gray I remembered. He led me past the chapel, past the arrangement room, to a small office with a fireproof safe built into the wall. He pulled out a metal box and set it on the desk. Inside was a sealed ceramic container no larger than a tea canister, labeled with my mother's name, date of cremation, and a lot number. Beside it, a white envelope with my name in my mother's handwriting. I couldn't open it there. I thanked Charles, and he simply said, "Your mother wanted you to have this. She made sure we understood the circumstances." I didn't ask what circumstances. I already knew. In the car, under the parking lot lights, I unsealed the envelope. Paper smelled faintly of her perfume, a light lavender that time had nearly erased. Her handwriting was steady, the same loops and slants from birthday cards and grocery lists. My dearest Megan, if you're reading this, it means someone did exactly what I feared they would. I don't know who, but I know your father's heart, and I know the kind of person he might lean on when I'm gone. Please don't blame him entirely. Grief makes people small, but I will not let anyone erase me from your life. I love you more than air, and because I couldn't bear the thought of you losing everything, I tucked something away. The account number below is for a savings account I opened in your name when you were born. I added a little every month, even when money was tight. The balance is modest, but it's yours for your education, for your wedding, for your future child, whatever future needs you have. I also left a letter with my attorney, but I prayed you'd never need it. The legacy portion was my insurance. If you're holding these ashes, then you know that no one can take me away from you. Scatter me somewhere beautiful, live a big life, and always know you were the best thing I ever did. All my love, Mom. The account number sat at the bottom, written twice for clarity. I sat in that parking lot and sobbed until my chest hurt. She had seen this coming. She had known that Barbara, or someone like Barbara, would try to sweep her memory out of the house like dust. And she had quietly, methodically, ensured I would still have her, both her ashes and her provision. The next morning, I called the bank. The account was still active, untouched, the balance just over $12,000. My mother, a school teacher who clipped coupons, had built a small fortress for me out of love and $20 deposits. But I still had to go home. I still had to look at my father and the woman who had emptied my mother's urn into a flower bed. I didn't know it yet, but Barbara was about to learn that erasing someone is not the same as burying them. And my father was about to remember whose ring he had worn first. When I walked through the front door, I was holding more than a canister of ashes. I was holding the truth, and I was finally ready to let it burn. The front door clicked shut behind me. Barbara was in the living room, folding laundry on the coffee table, the television murmuring some home renovation show. She looked up and her eyes went immediately to the small ceramic canister in my hands. Her face flickered confusion, then a cold recognition. She knew what it was. My mother had been reduced to a flower bed, but here she was again, in a sealed container stamped with her name and a date Barbara couldn't erase. "What is that?" she said, not as a question but as a challenge. I didn't answer. I walked past her into the kitchen, where my father was sitting at the table, staring into a cup of coffee like he'd been doing it for hours. He looked older than he had at dinner the night before. I set the canister on the table between them. "This is Mom. The crematorium kept a second portion. She arranged it years ago because she knew someone might try to throw her away. It comes with a letter." I pulled the envelope from my bag, the paper still carrying that ghost of lavender. She wrote to me about the kind of person Dad might lean on. She didn't name names, but she knew grief would make him weak enough to let a woman like Barbara into our lives, and she was right. Barbara's mouth opened and closed. "That's absurd. I was helping this family move forward. Robert, tell her." My father didn't speak. I unfolded the letter and read the line out loud. "Grief makes people small." Then I looked at my father. "She left me a savings account, Dad. $12,000. She'd been putting money aside since I was born, just in case. She thought of everything, even the day someone would try to wipe her from existence." The silence stretched so thin I could hear the refrigerator humming. Barbara tried a different tactic. "This is manipulation. She's turning you against me." My father finally raised his head. His voice was raw, the way it sounded in the weeks after Mom died. "Did you empty her urn into the flower bed?" Barbara hesitated, then her chin lifted. "Yes." "I did. It was an old ceramic pot full of dust, and I was tired of living in a shrine. We're married, Robert. Me and you, not you and a ghost." He stood up slowly. "You had no right." 4 words, but they landed like a verdict. Barbara's composure cracked. "I had every right. I'm your wife. That woman has been dead for 7 years and you're still paralyzed. I was trying to free you." My father looked at her face, then at the canister on the table, then at me. "Get out of my house, Barbara." She stared, disbelieving. "You can't be serious." "Go to your sister's. I need time." She grabbed her purse, slammed the laundry basket on the floor, and stormed out. The front door shook the frame. Then it was just my dad and me and my mother's remains, back in the kitchen where she used to bake cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings. I expected relief. Instead, the confrontation left a hollow ache because I realized something else. My father had sat there the night before, saying nothing, while this woman announced she had discarded his first wife's ashes. He had been small, just as Mom predicted. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not Barbara's cruelty, I expected that, but his silence. I looked at him and asked, "Why didn't you stop her?" He didn't have an answer. He just sat back down, cradling his cold coffee, and wept. I left him there to cry and walked outside. In my mother's letter, there was one more line I hadn't read aloud. "Forgive your father, he's not strong like you." I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was ready to move on my own terms, with my mother's ashes still in my hands, and I knew exactly where I would take her. The coast was a 5-hour drive, and I made it with the windows down and my mother's canister in the passenger seat. She had always loved the ocean at Cape Disappointment, not for the name, but for the wildness of it, the way the waves slammed into the basalt cliffs and spray shot 40 feet into the air. We went every August when I was a kid, just the two of us, because Dad hated sand. She'd pack tuna sandwiches and we'd sit on a blanket, and she'd tell me stories about the ships that wrecked here, the sailors who swam ashore and the lighthouse keepers who pulled them out of the surf. "Resilience," she'd say, "is the most underrated virtue." I thought she was talking about history. She was talking about me. I parked at the trailhead and walked half a mile to a bluff overlooking the Pacific. The wind snapped my hair into my face. Below, the ocean churned gray and green, endless and indifferent. I unscrewed the lid of the canister. Inside, the ashes were a coarse grayish-white, heavier than I expected, the physical reality of a life reduced to mineral and memory. I held the container in both hands and thought about the flower bed at home, where Barbara had dumped the first portion. Those ashes would wash into the soil, feed the azaleas, and nobody would ever know. But these were mine. My mother had sealed them away with her own signature, her own foresight, and I owed her a better goodbye. I didn't give a speech. I just tipped the canister and watched the ashes stream out into the wind, catching the light for a moment before they dispersed over the water. A few landed on the rocks below, a few blew back and caught in my hair. I laughed and cried at the same time. Then I said, "Thank you, Mom, for everything, for the letter, for the money, for knowing before I did." I stood there until the sun started to set, and I felt something loosen in my chest, like a fist unclenching after 7 years. When I got home the next day, the house felt different. Barbara's car was gone. Her closet was half empty, the bathroom counter stripped of her lotions and her flat iron. My father was sitting on the back porch, staring at the grass. He looked up when I walked out and his eyes were red. "She's staying at her sister's," he said. "I asked for a separation." I sat down next to him. We didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "She wanted me to choose, and I chose wrong. Every day since your mother died, I've chosen wrong." I didn't absolve him. But I didn't walk away either. "Mom forgave you in advance," I said. "She wrote it in the letter. She said you weren't strong like me. Maybe she was wrong about that. Maybe you just needed a chance to prove you were." He reached over and held my hand. It was the first time we had touched like that since the funeral. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new rhythm. Barbara filed for divorce, claiming irreconcilable differences, which was the legal translation of "I threw out my husband's dead wife's ashes and got caught." My father started seeing a grief counselor, the one he should have seen years ago. He asked me once, quietly, if he could visit the crematorium himself, to see the vault, to understand the program. I took him. Charles showed us the ledger where my mother's name was recorded, and my father traced it with his finger and didn't say a word. On the way out, he asked Charles if he could prearrange his own legacy portion, so I'd never have to go through this again. Charles gave him the forms, and the savings account, $12,463. I used part of it to fund a scholarship at my mother's old high school for students pursuing teaching degrees. The rest I set aside, exactly as she'd instructed, for a future child I hope to have someday. A daughter, maybe, who I'll take to Cape Disappointment and tell her about the grandmother who planned everything, who left a trail of breadcrumbs through the worst grief I'd ever known, and who proved that love is smarter than cruelty every single time. But there was one more thing. Inside the ceramic canister, after I'd scattered the ashes, I noticed a tiny folded paper taped to the bottom of the lid, something I'd missed in my rush to the coast. I unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a single line, in my mother's handwriting. "I knew you'd find your way back to the sea." She had tucked that note inside the sealed container at the crematorium 7 years earlier, knowing I'd only find it when I was ready to let go. She had been guiding me the whole time, even from the vault, even from the grave, even from a flower bed she never should have touched. That's my story. Barbara thought she could throw my mother away like last week's garbage, but she underestimated something she never bothered to understand. She underestimated a woman who planned her own funeral, who chose a legacy portion program, who put $12,000 aside in $20 increments, and who tucked a note inside a sealed canister just so I would find it 7 years later. My mother did not just love me. She prepared for me. That is the difference between sentiment and legacy. And here is the beautiful irony. Barbara's cruelty did not destroy my connection to my mother. It unleashed it. She wanted me to move on, and I did. Not into forgetting, but into deeper remembering. I scattered my mother's ashes at the coast she loved, on my own terms, with her final note in my pocket. No one can take that away now. My father is healing, slowly. The house feels lighter. And somewhere in a crematorium vault, Charles has a new file with my father's name on it because he wanted to make sure I would never have to fight this fight again. So now I have a question for you. Has someone ever prepared something for you? A letter, a secret account, a promise that protected you when you needed it most? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where in the world you are listening from. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that button. I would love to have you here for the next one. Until then, hold on to the people who plan ahead. Hold on to the ones who love you with their actions, not just their words. Because that kind of love, it outlasts everything.